One of the best ways to become a better educator in higher education is to reflect on your own teaching practices. As I already mentioned in previous recordings, this is something that there are not always structural conditions for. Educators simply don't always have the time to stop and reflect on their own teaching activities, let alone write about them. But this reminds me of the perspectives developed by the American philosopher and organizational theorist Donald Schoen, starting with his book, The Reflective Practitioner. As I read Schoen, he emphasizes that professionalism is not something that you have after uh, something that you possess after you obtained it, like a quality that you have. Instead, he believes that it involves an ongoing process where you constantly allow your knowledge and skills to be critically examined. Here, Schoen makes a distinction between the ability to reflect uh, during and after the action. So reflect during, reflection in action, and after the action, reflection on action. Let's take a lecture as an example to describe these situations. The professional education then will prepare their teaching, the lecture, so that it will be successful and thus contribute to the students' learning. But even though the educator is prepared, there is no guarantee that everything will run smoothly. Teaching situations are characterized by uncertainty. They are fluid in the sense that it's not possible to anticipate in advance all the challenges, opportunities, and so on that may or may not arrive while doing the lecture. For a professional educator, however, there is this is not necessarily a problem as long as you actively practice what then Schoen calls reflection in action. This means that the educator observes, reevaluates, and adopts their research teaching based on the conditions that spontaneously arise during during a lecture. They are actually reflecting on the action that is actually happening right now. If they notice that their teaching is not engaging, they can choose to change it in the moment to arouse further engagement, for example, by asking interesting questions to the students. Reflection in action thus means an ability to reflect on the situations you are in and adapt to what you identify in that moment. Schoen usually describes this as tacit knowledge, a kind of practical and intuitive knowledge that is difficult to grasp, but which allows you to act spontaneously in different situations. So possessing tacit knowledge is also what most people would identify with professionalism, thus being an expert, you could call it, in any situation, in a particular situation, sorry. But at the same time, this is a rather limited view of what professionalism entails, according to Schoen. As I already mentioned, this reduces professionalism to something that you have and that you just use. But for sure, professionalism is also about reflecting on what happened, especially if something went wrong. It's not unreasonable to say that all educators will one day be faced with situations where they notice that their knowledge and skills were not enough during, for example, then a lecture, which is our example. In other words, the reflection in action was not able to handle the uncertainty of teaching. For this reason, the professional trainer also needs to practice what Schoen describes as reflection on action. Reflection on action is about looking back at one's actions in any given situation. If you were faced with a situation you could not handle in your teaching during a lecture, then you should therefore ask yourself, what happened? In this way, you can take responsibility for the situation, learn from it, and thus develop. Schoen thus contributes with broader understanding of professionalism that does not reduce it to a quality that you have, but as an ongoing process where you evaluate your actions so that progress and improvement become possible. As I mentioned, reflection on action is especially important if something goes wrong, but it is also important to make the same reflections when things go well. By looking back, as in our example at a lecture, regardless of how it went, that allows the educator to develop their tacit knowledge. By identifying what worked and what didn't, trying to understand situations that one could not immediately understand, one can begin the process of internalizing strategies, methods, and insights that may otherwise be difficult to put into words. Over time, according to Schoen, this will develop into tacit knowledge in the sense that it can be used as reflection in action spontaneously. Thus, by reflecting on one's own actions, in this case teaching or during a lecture, one can develop into an educator who is better able to handle a larger variety of teaching situations when they do arise. It should be pointed out that it is problematic to adapt Schoen's perspectives, as is some of Schoen's critics emphasize that there are, generally speaking, few structural conditions for educators to reflect in a way that he proposes, and that there are even structures that limit how freely one can reflect about one's own teaching and how freely one can adopt one's practices within an established and sometimes quite rigid educational setting. This is something that educational developers like me must take into account when we organize courses. But having said that, I see it as part of my and my colleagues' mission to create structural conditions for then reflection on action. This is done primarily by arranging courses in teaching and learning higher education. Therefore, as you will notice during the course of the program, to the extent that you are now teaching in higher education, we will invite you to look at your own teaching practice and critically examine it. We would therefore like you to invite you to reflection on action so that you can develop your tacit knowledge. Another problem with Schoen is that he tends to describe this as if it were an individual activity. Reflection on action actually has a potential for greater gains if it takes place in groups, which I will talk about in the next video. See you there.